The autumn light in rural Barr, Vermont, has a particular quality to it, thin and blue-gray, as though the sky itself has been pressed flat between the hills. On a Tuesday morning in October, 48 years after her marriage, Edith Garner stood in her rented cottage kitchen, holding a letter from her late husband's lawyer. The letter was 17 days old. She had read it 37 times. The words never changed, no matter how carefully she examined them, no matter how many times she whispered them aloud, as though repetition might alter their meaning. Frank was dead. Frank had owned the Garner Cosgrove Granite Company. Frank had also, apparently, owned very little else, at least according to Ray Cosgrove and the papers Ray had produced. Papers signed by both Frank and Ray in 1993, clearly stating that Frank's ownership stake in the company was 30%. 30%. She knew, with the bone-deep certainty that comes from 40 years of keeping a company's books, that this was a lie. Edith was 72 years old. She had been 71 when Frank suffered his heart attack while checking equipment at the Quarry on an April morning when the maples were just beginning to leaf out. The time since his death had moved with a strange elasticity. Some hours lasted for what felt like days, while entire weeks seemed to evaporate without her conscious participation. She had dressed in black for the funeral. She had accepted casseroles from neighbors. She had thanked people for their sympathy. She had written thank you notes in her careful, precise handwriting. She had done all the things that a 71-year-old widow in Vermont is supposed to do, and all the while she had known with a kind of cold certainty that something was very wrong. Frank Garner had not been a formally educated man. He had grown up in Barr, the son of a stonemason, and he had apprenticed in the quarries when he was 14 years old. By the time he was 21, he understood granite in a way that very few people do, not just as stone, but as structure, as memory, as possibility. He could look at a quarry wall and see the grain, understand the stress lines, predict how it would break. He could feel the weight of it in his bones. When he was 30, he had partnered with Ray Cosgrove, a salesman from out of state who had a gift for talking to customers and a gift for mathematics. Together, they had built Garner Cosgrove from a single small quarry into a respected regional company with contracts from Boston to Montreal. Frank had been the stone. Ray had been the tongue. Edith had married Frank in 1975. She had been 21 years old, working as a bookkeeper for a Barry accounting firm, and she had recognized in Frank something she recognized in herself: a quiet competence, a patience with detail, a deep wariness of anyone who promised easy answers. They had married on a Saturday in June in the small Congregational church on Main Street. 48 years later, she could still remember the exact shade of blue in the stained glass window where the afternoon light had caught them during the vows. She could remember Frank's hand trembling slightly as he placed the gold band on her finger. She could remember thinking, with absolute conviction, that she had chosen correctly. The bookkeeping work for Garner Cosgrove had begun informally, Frank asking her to organize receipts and invoices in the evenings while he read the newspaper, and they listened to the Red Sox on the radio. By 1981, when the company was formalized and officially registered, Edith had negotiated a salary and became the official bookkeeper and office manager. She had insisted on meticulous record-keeping. She had created ledgers that were works of art, every entry perfectly aligned, every number justified, every line carefully drawn. She had known, down to the last cent, what the company was worth, where every dollar came from, where it went. She had known the original partnership agreement by heart. 70% Frank, 30% Ray. Frank had designed the quarry walls the way a sculptor designs marble. Ray had charmed the customers. Both were essential. Both were valued accordingly. For 39 years, she had kept those books. For 39 years, nothing had been disputed. The partnership agreement had lived in Frank's office safe, along with his will and their insurance policies and the deed to their house. At 68, Frank had decided to retire. He had offered to sell his stake to Ray. Ray had demurred, said he needed time to think about it, to crunch the numbers. That had been 4 years ago. The agreement remained unsigned. Frank had continued working part-time, training younger men in the technical aspects of quarry management. Ray had continued running the business side. They had continued their partnership, unchanged and unresolved. 3 weeks after Frank's funeral, Ray Cosgrove had arrived at Edith's cottage with an attorney. Ray had been wearing an expensive jacket, olive green, the kind of thing that suggested taste and money in equal measure. His shoes had been polished. He had taken her hand in both of his and expressed his sympathy with a warmth that felt, to Edith, like warmth that had been specifically manufactured for the occasion. The attorney, a thin man with a precisely trimmed beard, and the kind of manner that suggested he had been trained specifically to make people feel small, had produced documents. The documents stated that Frank's ownership in Garner Cosgrove was 30%, not 70%. Ray explained, and the attorney explained, redundantly, that Frank and Ray had amended their partnership agreement in 1993. There had been a new agreement, a new arrangement. Ray had bought out a portion of Frank's stake. Surely Edith remembered this. The attorney produced a signature page. It was Frank's signature. It was notarized. It was dated. The whole thing had a kind of terrible efficiency to it, the efficiency of a process that had been planned in meticulous detail and was being executed with mechanical precision. Edith had offered them coffee, which she would later recognize as an absurd response to theft and fraud. They had declined. Ray had sat across from her in her small cottage living room, surrounded by her life with Frank. Photographs on the mantelpiece, a quilt that Frank's mother had made, books that Frank had read and marked, with his neat pencil notes in the margins. He had sat in the very chair that Frank had favored, and he had explained, with the sincere regret of a man genuinely sorry about a minor inconvenience, that Edith's husband had made a poor business decision 30 years earlier, and that there was simply nothing to be done about it now. The partnership, Ray said, had been restructured. Frank had accepted significantly reduced ownership in exchange for a cash payment that Ray was sure Frank had used wisely. Frank was always a good man, Ray had said, but he didn't have much head for numbers. That's why you were so important to the company, Edith. You kept the books straight while Frank worried about the stone. The compliment had felt like a slap. Ray was saying, in other words, that because Edith had kept the books, she should know about this amendment, should remember it, should not be surprised by it. Edith had stared at the signature for what felt like a very long time. It was Frank's signature. There was no doubt of that. She recognized the particular way he crossed his T's, the small idiosyncratic loop at the end of his name. But something about it made her skin crawl. The document itself was pristine, uncreased, unmarked. There was no corresponding entry in any of the ledgers she had kept. There was no memo in Frank's files. There was no trace of this amendment in any of the company records, 39 years of company records that she had personally maintained. She had said very quietly, "I need to see the original agreement." Ray had looked uncomfortable. The attorney had shuffled papers. They had admitted eventually that the original agreement could not be located. Frank's office safe had been opened after his death. They understood Edith had been given the keys, and the agreement had not been there. Ray expressed his regret about this. Ray also expressed certainty that the amended agreement was perfectly legal and binding. Ray was very sorry, but the company was valuable, and Frank's estate could not claim more than the 30% that he had owned at the time of his death. After they left, Edith had sat in her cottage kitchen for 4 hours without moving. Outside, October rain had begun to fall, drumming on the roof and streaming down the windows in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as though the sky itself was grieving. The maples in her small yard had turned the color of old blood, and the fir trees had gone nearly black in the gray light. She had felt, with a clarity that bordered on physical pain, the sensation of something being stolen from her. Not money. She had never been greedy about money, and Frank's pension and savings would sustain her, though modestly. What had been stolen was the truth, and more than the truth, the sense that Frank's lifetime of work, his partnership with Ray, his careful building of something real and substantial, was being systematically erased. It was as though Ray was not just taking the company, but taking Frank's history, rewriting the past to suit himself, telling a story in which Frank had been less essential, less important, less worthy of remembrance. And if Ray could do this to Frank's memory, Edith understood with sudden frightening clarity, then he could do it to anyone's memory. He could remake the past according to his own needs and desires. He could tell lies until the lies became the only truth that anyone believed. This thought had terrified her more than the actual loss of money. She could learn to live more modestly. She could adjust to reduced circumstances, but she could not bear to watch someone she loved be systematically erased from history, rewritten as something less than he had been. The cottage that Edith rented was small, and she had come to understand, slightly damp. It was the kind of place where condensation formed on windows in winter, where the heating system labored inefficiently, where the kitchen sink drained with a kind of reluctant gurgle that suggested philosophical disagreement with the concept of plumbing. But it was what her modest settlement had afforded her. The house that she and Frank had owned for 30 years had been sold to pay for her care and Frank's medical bills during his final illness. That had been 7 years ago, before his heart attack. They had intended to downsize anyway, they had told themselves, but the cottage had never felt like home. It felt like a way station, a temporary arrangement, a place from which one might depart at any moment. Edith's daughter Karen lived in Seattle with her husband and 2 children. Karen had flown to Vermont for the funeral. She had spent a week helping her mother sort through Frank's belongings. She had wept in Frank's study as she packed up his books, geology texts mostly, worn paperbacks and reference manuals that Frank had read and reread until his notes filled the margins. Karen had urged her mother to move to Seattle, to live near her grandchildren, to start over. Edith had demurred gently. She belonged here, she said. The New England winters did not frighten her. She would be fine. Karen called every Sunday, and Edith reported on the weather and the garden and the neighbors. And Karen listened with the concerned patience of a daughter who knew that her mother was grieving something more than the simple fact of her husband's death. 2 months after the lawyer's visit, while sorting through boxes in her bedroom closet, Edith found a leather satchel that she did not immediately recognize. Inside were Frank's field notebooks, journals he had kept during his work at the quarries, small bound books filled with sketches and observations and notes. They covered 40 years. She had forgotten that he kept them, or perhaps she had simply never paid sufficient attention. Frank was a private man, and she had long ago learned not to pry into his small solitudes. She began to read, and within the first notebook she found herself transported back to Frank's younger self, a man of 25, newly married, excited about the work he was doing in the quarries. The handwriting was less controlled then, more enthusiastic. There were sketches of quarry faces and attempts at geological classification that suggested Frank was teaching himself through careful observation and occasional conversations with visiting geologists. There were sketches of his father, who had died when Frank was 32. There were sketches of Ray Cosgrove in his younger years, energetic and smiling, before his face had become fleshy and calculating. Reading the notebooks, Edith could see the partnership in its youth. 2 men with complementary skills and genuine affection for each other, building something real together out of stone and determination and dream. The notebooks were magnificent. They contained sketches of geological formations, notes on stone quality, observations about weather patterns and their effects on quarry work. They contained, in Frank's careful handwriting, theories about the granite's mineral composition and its commercial value. They contained drawings, fine, precise drawings, of the men who worked in the quarries. Frank had been a careful observer. He had understood not just stone, but the men who broke it, the way their bodies moved, their vulnerabilities and strengths. He had understood something about the human condition that came only from patient watching. In one notebook, there was a sketch of a young quarry worker named Samuel, who Frank noted had worked in the quarry for 3 years without ever complaining about the physical toll. Samuel had injured his leg during a blast that went wrong, and Frank's notes documented the injury and its progression with a kind of tenderness that suggested Frank had genuinely cared about this man's welfare. There were notes about other workers too, their families, their struggles, their small triumphs. Frank had carried these people inside him, not as anonymous labor, but as human beings who depended on his skill to keep them safe. The final notebook was dated the year before his death. In it, Edith found something that made her hands shake. Entries that showed Frank's decline, his awareness of his own mortality, his increasing preoccupation with legacy and what he would leave behind. The handwriting wavered occasionally, as though written after pain medication or during moments of physical struggle. But it never became illegible. Frank had maintained his precision until the very end. It was a sketch of the flooded quarry on their property, the 5 acres that Ray had laughed about on the day he took the company. Frank had sketched the quarry carefully, showing the walls and the water level and the depth. He had drawn a detailed map of the north wall. And on that north wall, he had circled a spot approximately 20 feet below the water line. Next to the circle, in his handwriting, were 4 words: "For Edith, when the time comes." She had stared at those words for a long time. She had read them repeatedly, as though repetition might yield new meaning. She had whispered them aloud, testing the sounds, as if the words themselves might offer some kind of explanation if she just pronounced them correctly. Frank had never explained this to her. He had mentioned the quarry occasionally, saying he needed to go check on it, enjoy some quiet time there. Every Sunday morning, without fail, Frank would drive to the quarry and spend 2 or 3 hours there alone. In summer, he would stay longer. In winter, he would go even if the weather was terrible, driving through snow or rain to sit by the flooded stone, watching the light change on the water. Edith had learned not to ask why. She had respected his need for solitude, understood that some men required time alone to think, to process the weight of the world. She had assumed he meant solitude, contemplation, perhaps geological observation. The quarry had belonged to his family before him. His grandfather had owned it, and his father had worked it before moving to California. Frank had bought it back from its most recent owner in the late 1960s, though he had done nothing with it once it had naturally flooded. He kept the land, paid the taxes, paid the modest insurance, and seemed to regard the flooded quarry with a kind of affection that Edith had never fully understood. Now she wondered if Frank had been standing on that rim in all those Sunday mornings over all those years, thinking about Ray and the partnership and the way the company was growing and the way Ray's envy was growing with it. Perhaps Frank had been going there to calm himself, to remember what mattered, to prepare for a future he could not yet name. She turned the notebook over in her hands. The leather was soft from use, the pages worn at the edges. She turned back to the sketch. The precision of it suggested that this was no casual marking. Frank had drawn this intentionally. He had left this for her. The question was what exactly was 20 feet below the waterline on the north wall of the quarry. Edith made a phone call to a dive shop in Barra that she found in the phone book. The man who answered was named Tom, and he was, he explained, a retired Navy diver who had opened the shop 5 years earlier. Yes, he could dive a quarry. Yes, he understood that quarries were dangerous. They were deep and cold, and the waters were murky. But he had been diving for 42 years, including in much worse conditions than a Vermont quarry. He would need some kind of reference point for where to look. Did she have a location? 3 days later, Edith drove to the quarry for the first time in nearly 5 years. The access road was overgrown, barely passable. The abandoned equipment shed sagged at the property's far end, its wood grayed and weathered to the color of old bone. The rusted chain-link fence that ringed the quarry was half buried in leaf litter and wild brush. The property, which had once represented safety and continuity, now felt haunted by its own emptiness. Edith parked her car and took out the leather suitcase with brass clasps that had belonged to Frank's father. She had packed it with a change of clothes, a thermos of coffee, and her 3 most necessary medications. She was not sure why she had done this, except that the act of packing suggested seriousness of purpose. The autumn air was cold and tasted of rain and leaf mold. The maples around the quarry were in their final transformation, the red deepening to burgundy, the edges browning. The birches had begun their descent into winter nakedness, their white trunks glowing in the gray light like bones. The quarry itself was utterly still. The water had the texture of dark glass. Nothing moved on its surface. From the rim, Edith could see perhaps 30 feet down before the water's darkness swallowed vision entirely. She had forgotten how deep it was, how absolute the quality of its silence. Tom arrived in a blue truck with lettering on the side advertising his shop. He was a tall man in his 60s, with gray hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent significant time in water. He wore a simple jacket against the October chill and moved with the economical grace of an athlete. He greeted Edith with a friendly handshake and studied the quarry with a professional eye. She showed him Frank's notebook and the sketch with the circled spot. He nodded thoughtfully. 20 feet, he said. Doable. Quarry water is cold, probably 45 degrees, but visibility should be reasonable. The trick is finding the exact spot. You sure about the location? As sure as I can be, Edith said. He drew it very carefully. Tom was quiet for a moment, reading the words for Edith when the time comes in Frank's handwriting. This something important? He asked, not unkindly. Everything, Edith said. Tom prepared his equipment with the methodical precision of a man for whom preparation was the difference between life and death. He explained what he was doing as he worked, unrolling hoses and checking seals and testing his air regulator. He was a teacher, evidently, someone who believed that knowledge diminished fear. He explained the dangers and the precautions. He explained the physics of water pressure and buoyancy and cold. He explained how deep water increased pressure exponentially and how the body responded to that pressure with nitrogen narcosis, and how a diver had to know his own physiology well enough to recognize when the pressure was starting to affect his thinking. He explained how to navigate in darkness. He explained that the quarry, despite its appearance of emptiness, might contain submerged debris or wreckage from the old quarry days that could snag equipment or cause disorientation. He wasn't reckless, but he wasn't afraid. Edith envied him this, and she also appreciated it, this willingness to name the dangers rather than pretend they did not exist. She sat on the rim of the quarry, her feet dangling above the dark water, and watched Tom descend. He moved through the air like a man walking downstairs, deliberate, purposeful, utterly at home. He checked his equipment one final time, ensuring that his flashlight was secure, that his knife was accessible, that his air gauge was readable. He had explained that the knife was not for defense, but for practical use, cutting away any tangled lines or vegetation that might catch on the way out. Then he had backed toward the rim, his fins in his hands, his tank on his back, his face hidden behind a mask that made him look inhuman and ancient at once. He had given her a thumbs up, checking one more time to make sure she understood the signals. Then he had put on his fins and turned toward the water. He entered the water without hesitation, a decisive backward roll that took him from air to water in a single fluid motion. For a long time, she could see him, a dark shape beneath the glass-smooth surface, his flashlight creating a small circle of illumination in the darkness below. Then the angle changed, and he disappeared entirely into the depths. Only the bubbles rising to the surface confirmed that he was still alive, still breathing, still searching. Edith had never been afraid of silence, but this silence was different. It was the silence of a person waiting to learn whether the world made sense or whether it was, as she had begun to fear, fundamentally absurd. The silence of a widow whose husband had died and taken with him the explanation of almost everything. The silence of a woman who had kept perfect books for 40 years, only to discover that someone else was keeping a different set entirely. The bubbles continued to rise. The water remained still except for the small disturbances created by the rising air. The quarry, unchanged for 5 years, seemed to hold its breath alongside her. When Tom emerged, he was holding something. Even from a distance, She could see that it was substantial, heavy enough that his movements as he hauled himself out of the water were labored. She stood and moved to help him. Together, they pulled a large, cylindrical steel drum from the water and onto the weathered stone of the quarry rim. It was sealed with what looked like marine epoxy, wrapped at the top with a waterproof gasket. 40 years in cold water had not corroded it or damaged it in any visible way. It was as though time had simply chosen not to touch it. Edith's hands were shaking as she examined the drum. Tom rubbed water from his face and watched her with the kind of focused attention he might have given to something fragile. "What is it?" he asked. "I don't know," Edith said, "but Frank left it there for me." They carried the drum to the cottage. It took both of them to move it. It was heavier than it looked, and the water dripping from it soaked their clothes and made the brass handles slick. Tom said nothing as they worked, understanding instinctively that whatever was in the drum mattered to Edith in a way that required respect and silence. The October afternoon was beginning to fade. Overhead, the maples glowed in the low light, and the birches seemed to absorb the dying sun. Inside the cottage, the kitchen was warm, lit by the afternoon light coming through the small window. The table where Edith and Frank had eaten thousands of meals sat waiting, as though it had always known that this moment was coming. Edith ran her hands over the wood, scarred and worn, familiar. In the cottage's small kitchen, on a worn wooden table that had belonged to Frank's parents, Edith used a utility knife to carefully cut through the epoxy seal. She worked slowly, aware that this moment was important, that she was entering a threshold that would divide her life into before and after. Tom watched, not hovering but present, ready to help if she needed him. The seal was thick, marine epoxy, Frank had written in his letter, which was stronger and more waterproof than ordinary epoxy. It had protected the contents for 40 years. As she cut through it, white foam occasionally puffed out, showing the air pockets that had insulated what lay inside. The cutting took nearly 20 minutes. Layer by layer, she removed the protective wrapping, peeling back what Frank had painstakingly sealed to protect for this moment. The waterproof bags inside were themselves sealed with marine epoxy. Inside those bags, still protected by packets of desiccant that had kept moisture at bay for decades, were 3 things. The first was the original partnership agreement. The paper was yellowed but intact, protected by the waterproof seal. The handwriting was Frank's, the signatures unmistakable. Dated 1981, notarized, clearly stating that Frank Garner owned 70% of Garner Cosgrove Granite Company and Ray Cosgrove owned 30%. Below it, sealed in its own waterproof envelope, was a letter from Ray Cosgrove, dated 1993, withdrawing his fraudulent claim to the company and admitting that he had removed the original agreement from Frank's office safe after becoming convinced that Frank intended to force a sale that would require Ray to liquidate his personal assets to continue operating the company. The second was a collection of rare mineral core samples, specimens that Frank had collected over decades, many of them from geological formations that no longer existed, quarries that had been worked out and abandoned. The samples were labeled in Frank's precise handwriting and included high-grade specimens of tourmaline, beryl, and rare feldspar that universities and private collectors would, Edith eventually discovered, pay considerable money for. Frank had been systematic in his collection, dating each sample and noting where it came from and what made it particularly valuable. Some of the samples were beautiful, clear crystals that seemed to hold light inside them, rich colors that suggested something precious had been captured in stone. Edith realized as she examined them that Frank had been building a kind of geological library, a record of the stone formations that he had encountered throughout his lifetime of work. These were not casual acquisitions, but deliberate documentation, the work of a man who loved stone, not just for commercial purposes, but for its intrinsic beauty and its role in the deep history of the earth. The third was a letter. The envelope bore Edith's name in Frank's handwriting, written with the care and precision that characterized everything he did. It was dated 6 months before his death, suggesting that Frank had prepared this letter during a period of time when his health was already uncertain, when the tightness in his chest that would eventually kill him had already begun to make itself known. The letter was thick, several pages, written on the cream-colored stationery that Edith had given Frank years earlier. The paper smelled faintly of the basement where Frank had kept his personal papers, of time and careful preservation. She opened it carefully and began to read. "My dear Aggie," it began. Frank had always called her Aggie, a nickname from her childhood that had somehow stuck. "If you're reading this, I've gone. I'm sorry for that, though not surprised. I've had pains in my chest for months now, and I know what they mean. The doctor says my heart is tired. Fair enough. A man works for 70 years, and eventually something gives out. I'm writing this to explain something I should have explained years ago. 3 years ago, when I was in the hospital after my first attack, Ray came to visit me. He seemed worried, which seemed genuine at the time. But while he was there, he told me something interesting. He told me that he had convinced himself, over the years, that our partnership agreement was unfair, that he had done the real work of building the business while I simply broke stone. He told me he was considering a legal challenge. He told me that he had already begun, subtly, to remove evidence of the original agreement from the office files. This made me think. You know me, Aggie. I'm not one for drama or confrontation. The easy thing would have been to let him have the company, to retire quietly and accept whatever settlement he offered. But that felt like accepting a lie, and I've never been able to do that. So I put the agreement in a drum, and I sealed it, and I brought it down to the quarry one Sunday morning. I carved a niche in the north wall, about 20 feet down, in a spot where Ray would never think to look. Ray hates water. He hates getting dirty. The quarry was never his place. It was always ours, mine and his father's and grandfather's. I've enclosed Ray's letter admitting to his theft. I've enclosed the original agreement. I've also included some of the mineral samples I've been collecting. You always said I spent too much time with rocks, Aggie. I suppose you were right, but some of these rocks are beautiful, and some of them are valuable. Maybe you can do something with them. I'm sorry I didn't tell you all of this while I was alive. I kept thinking I'd have more time. I kept thinking I'd resolve it somehow and you'd never have to worry about it. But the truth is, I knew what was coming. The quarry keeps what matters. You kept what matters. The rest is just stone and water. I love you. That's the only thing that matters. Everything else, the company, the money, the stupid disagreement with Ray, none of that is worth a moment of your grief. When you read this, I'll already be dead, and the only important thing will be that you remember I loved you. I'm leaving you the maps and the location. Use them if you need to, or don't. The quarry will keep the secret either way. Frank. Edith read the letter 3 times without stopping. On the 4th reading, she found that she could no longer see the words because her eyes were filled with tears. She had not cried since the funeral, despite the social acceptability and even encouragement to do so. Grief, she had decided, was something to be managed quietly, internally, without public display. But Frank's letter unmade this decision entirely. She cried in a way she had not cried since childhood. Not from sadness exactly, though sadness was certainly present, but from a kind of overwhelming recognition that she had been understood. Frank had known her. He had known that she could not bear to accept a lie, could not let an injustice stand if she had any way to prevent it. He had prepared for his death, not by pretending it wouldn't happen, but by giving her the tools to fight for the truth after he was gone. The next morning, Edith hired a business litigation attorney named Margaret Chen from a firm in Montpellier. She brought Frank's original partnership agreement and Ray's admission letter to the attorney's office. Margaret Chen studied the documents in silence for a long time. Then she looked up at Edith with an expression of careful professional neutrality. "Where did you get these?" she asked. Edith explained. Margaret listened without interrupting. When Edith finished, Margaret said, "This is very good. The notarization on the original agreement is legally binding and establishes clear ownership. Ray's letter is an admission of fraud, which strengthens your position considerably. The company was built on false pretenses. You have grounds for a very substantial claim." Margaret was right. Over the next 18 months, the case proceeded through discovery and depositions and increasingly desperate attempts by Ray's attorneys to discredit the documents or question their authenticity. But the documents were authentic. The agreement was legitimate. Ray's fraud was documented in his own handwriting. The court ruled in Edith's favor. She was awarded her rightful 70% stake in the company, back payments and interest going back to Frank's death, and damages for the original theft. The settlement was substantial. Not life-changing in the way that sudden wealth might be, but sufficient to represent what Frank's lifetime of work had actually been worth. Edith did not take over the company. Running Garner Cosgrove would have required her to work alongside Ray during a transition period, and she found that she could not bear to do this. Instead, she arranged to sell her 70% stake to a larger New England granite firm that had been interested in purchasing Garner Cosgrove for years. The sale went through in the spring, on a day when the Vermont maples were just beginning to show their first green. The money from the sale was transferred to Edith's account, and Ray Cosgrove was forced to sell his remaining 30% to cover his legal fees and the damages awarded against him. With a portion of the settlement, Edith established the Frank Garner Geological Scholarship at the University of Vermont's Geology Department. The scholarship was specifically designed to support students from rural backgrounds who showed promise in mineralogy and geological study. In her application memo, Edith explained that her late husband had spent his life working with stone and had had a gift for understanding rock in ways that went beyond the purely commercial. She hoped that this scholarship would support young people who possessed similar gifts, the ability to see beauty and structure and deep time in the geological record. With another portion, she hired a local contractor and a mason to build a small cabin on the Quarry property. She worked with the architect to design something that would honor the land while remaining modest and practical. The cabin was simple: 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, a large room with windows facing the quarry. The walls were built using granite from the quarry itself, fitted and mortared in the traditional way. Edith moved into the cabin in the early autumn of the second year after Frank's death. She had lived there for 2 years now, and it had become, in a way she had never expected, home. The mineral samples that Frank had collected went to the university's geology department, where they were cataloged and added to the teaching collection. Professors used them in courses. Students examined them and learned from them. A traveling exhibition of Frank's samples was shown at regional museums. In this way, Frank's collection, which had seemed at the time like a private eccentricity, became part of the public knowledge of geology in New England. Karen had come to visit for a month that first autumn after the cabin was completed. She had walked with her mother around the quarry rim and listened to the story of the drum and the letter and the years of litigation. She had sat in her mother's new home and understood finally what her mother had been grieving, not just Frank's death, but the injustice of his erasure. She had held her mother while she cried. She had also, quietly and with considerable emotion of her own, thanked her mother for teaching her the value of truth, even when truth was costly and difficult. Now, on a November evening, Edith sat on a granite block at the quarry's rim as the sun descended toward the western hills. The water was very still. The birch trees had lost their leaves, and their white trunks glowed in the fading light like bones. The cabin was dark behind her. She had not yet turned on the evening lights. She was alone, as she often was, and the silence was neither empty nor sad. It was the silence of a person who had lived a long life and was beginning to understand what her life had actually meant. She wore her moss-green quilted vest over a cream wool turtleneck, and her brown leather suitcase sat beside her on the stone. The suitcase belonged to Frank's father now, in a sense. Or rather, it belonged to the memory of Frank's father, and to Frank, and to all the careful, quiet men who had done the work of understanding stone and land and the way the world was put together. In her pocket was a photograph. It was from the day of her wedding 54 years earlier. It showed Frank and Edith standing in front of the Congregational Church, his hand at her back, her hand in his. They looked young and terrified and absolutely certain. She had looked at this photograph many times over the years, on difficult days and joyful days and ordinary days when the light was gray and there seemed to be nothing to choose between them. But she had never looked at it the way she did now. Now, she understood that the young man in the photograph had been quietly, systematically planning for a moment that was decades away. He had been thinking about water and stone and the way time moves. He had been preparing to leave her something that mattered more than money, more than the company, more than the settlement that would follow his death. He had been leaving her the truth. He had been leaving her the knowledge that he had loved her enough to fight for her, even after he would be gone. Edith set the photograph on the stone beside her and looked out toward the quarry water, which now reflected the final gold of the sunset. The water was as still as it had been before Tom had descended into it, before the drum had been hauled to the surface, before everything had changed. But it was not the same water. It held within it now the record of what had been left in its depths. It held within it Frank's love and his careful planning and his absolute faith that Edith would understand what he had left for her. She thought about Ray Cosgrove, whose reputation in the stone business was destroyed, whose attempt to steal Frank's legacy had been thwarted by a simple letter and a waterproof drum. She thought about the years she had spent keeping perfect books, maintaining the truth in numerical form, only to discover that the truth would ultimately be found in stone and water and a dead man's handwriting. She thought about time, which moves forward always, which takes everything, which leaves nothing behind but memory and stone. She stood and picked up her suitcase and began walking back toward the cabin. Behind her, the quarry continued its work of reflecting the sky. The stone walls, unchanged for millennia, held their secrets. The water, patient and cold, held what had been left in its depths and was content. In the cabin, Edith lit the evening lamps and prepared a simple dinner: bread and cheese and a cup of tea. She sat at her table by the window overlooking the quarry and thought about what Frank had written. The quarry keeps what matters. You kept what matters. She understood now that keeping what mattered was not something that happened all at once, in a single moment of clear decision. It was something that happened across decades, through small choices made in the darkness, through the work of turning pages and recording numbers and sitting quiet at the side of someone you loved. It was something that happened in the trust you placed in another person, in the assumption that if you were faithful to the truth while alive, your loved ones would be able to defend it after you were gone. The legal process had been emotionally exhausting. Sitting across from Ray Cosgrove in the deposition room, watching his attorney try to discredit Frank's memory, had required a kind of resolve that Edith did not know she possessed. Ray had looked at her with barely concealed contempt, the look of a man who believed that a 72-year-old widow could be intimidated into surrender through sheer force of personality and expensive legal representation. He had underestimated her profoundly. What Ray did not understand was that Edith had spent 40 years maintaining the absolute truth in numerical form. She knew precisely what the truth was. She could defend it with the kind of calm certainty that comes from long familiarity. When Ray's attorney asked her if she was certain that the original agreement had actually existed, if perhaps she was mistaking memory for fact, Edith had simply opened Frank's field notebooks and showed them the sketch with the date and the handwriting and the 4 words, "For Edith, when the time comes." The attorney had not asked another question about the agreement's existence. During the discovery phase, Frank's letter had been entered into evidence. The court allowed it because Frank had written it explicitly to establish his state of mind regarding the partnership, and because the letter's existence had been verified by multiple parties: Tom the diver, Edith's attorney, the court-appointed authenticator who had examined the letter for fraud. Ray had objected to its admission on the grounds that it was hearsay. The judge had overruled him. A man may speak from beyond the grave if he speaks truthfully, the judge had said, with a gentleness that suggested he understood exactly what had happened here. Ray had looked as though he had been struck. The settlement had come through in late spring, when the Vermont landscape was in that particular state of renewal that precedes summer. The money had been transferred to Edith's account in a series of transactions that her accountant explained with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely enjoyed explaining things. The number was substantial enough to make Edith feel secure for the remainder of her life, but not so large that it felt unreal or impossible to comprehend. She had the house built. She had the scholarship established. She had given Karen $100,000, which Karen had initially refused, and then after much discussion had accepted with tears. The rest remained in careful investment. Edith had learned from Frank that the best way to honor something was to make it grow, carefully and steadily, rather than to spend it all at once. Ray Cosgrove had disappeared from bar after the settlement. His attorney had informed Margaret Chen that Ray was relocating to Arizona and that he had sold his remaining stake in Garner Cosgrove to the larger firm at a considerable loss. Edith had not felt triumph at this news. She had felt, instead, a kind of sadness for the waste of it all. The decades that Ray and Frank had worked together, the genuine partnership that had built something real, all destroyed by Ray's inability to accept his own role in the company's success. Edith had learned, over the course of the litigation, that Ray had convinced himself over years of careful internal narratives that Frank had been the less essential partner. Ray had done this through a kind of progressive rewriting of history that happened gradually beneath his own conscious awareness. He had told himself stories until the stories became more real to him than the truth. When Edith's attorney had handed her the check for the settlement, Margaret Chen had told her something that Edith had thought about often in the years since. "You know," Margaret had said, "most people in your situation would have moved on. Most people would have accepted the loss and tried to rebuild. It takes a certain kind of person, a certain kind of stubborn integrity, to be willing to fight for the truth when it would have been much easier to let it go." Edith had not felt like she had been doing anything particularly exceptional. She had simply been refusing to accept a lie. But as time had passed, she had come to understand that this refusal was, in fact, a form of love. She had been fighting for Frank's memory, yes, but she had also been fighting for the principle that truth was worth fighting for, that integrity had actual weight in the world, that a person could be cheated and still maintain dignity by refusing to accept the cheater's version of events. The cabin that Edith had built was modest but beautiful. It had large windows on the quarry-facing side, and in the evening light, the stone walls glowed with a warm amber color that seemed to contain all of the late afternoons of Edith's life. She had furnished it simply: a comfortable bed, a sturdy table, shelves for her books, a wood stove for the Vermont winters. The most important feature, the one that she had insisted on despite the contractor's gentle attempts to talk her out of it, was a window seat with deep shelves. Here, she arranged Frank's field notebooks, his geological texts, his collection of interesting stones. The window seat faced the quarry so that while she was reading, she could look up and see the water that held Frank's secrets. On quiet mornings, Edith would sit in the window seat with a cup of coffee and read through Frank's notebooks again. Each time she read them, she noticed something new, a small margin note she had missed, a particularly beautiful sketch, a date that coincided with something she remembered from their shared life. In one notebook, she found a sketch of herself, done from memory, sitting at her desk doing bookkeeping. Frank had captured something essential in the drawing: the concentration, the care, the way her hands moved across the page. She had not known he had been watching her so carefully. Looking at the sketch, she had been struck by the tenderness of it. Frank had loved her the way he loved stone, with careful attention to the essential nature of the thing itself. Karen had visited for 2 weeks in the spring after Edith moved into the cabin. Karen's 2 children, who were 15 and 12, had spent much of their time exploring the quarry and the surrounding property. They had wanted to know everything: why their grandfather had hidden things in the water, whether the water was safe to swim in, how deep the quarry actually was. Karen had explained what she understood of the story, and Edith had filled in the details. Watching her grandchildren understand that their grandfather had been capable of such careful long-term planning had been moving in a way that Edith had not anticipated. The children had understood, in the way that young people often do, that Frank had loved their grandmother more than he had loved comfort or ease. They had respected him for this, and they had treated their grandmother with a kind of protective admiration that suggested they understood how lucky they were to carry Frank's genetic material forward into the future. On the night before Karen left to return to Seattle, the 3 of them, Karen, Edith, and Karen's older child, had sat on the quarry rim as the sun descended. Karen had brought wine, and Edith had brought cheese and bread, and they had sat in companionable silence, watching the light change on the stone walls. Eventually, Karen had said, "I understand now why you wanted to stay here. I thought it was sadness or habit, but it's not. It's that he's still here, not as a ghost exactly, but as something real, as the truth that he left behind." Edith had nodded. She could not have explained it better. The seasons changed in predictable cycles around the quarry. Summer brought tourists occasionally, who would drive down the overgrown access road looking for a swimming hole, only to find themselves on private property with an elderly woman who owned a very large German shepherd named Luther. Edith did not mind them much. She would give them water and politely ask them to leave, and most of them understood that the quarry was not a place for casual recreation. Some of them asked about the cabin, and Edith would tell them a little of the story. A few of them seemed to understand that they had stumbled onto something sacred. The autumn was Edith's favorite season, just as it had been Frank's. The maples turned colors that seemed impossible, reds like fire, golds like light made physical, purples that suggested something beyond the visible spectrum. The birches turned white and seemed to glow against the darker trees. The air turned cold and clean, and tasted of smoke and decay and renewal all at once. It was on an autumn evening, 2 years after Edith moved into the cabin, that she received a call from Margaret Chen, her attorney. Margaret had been reviewing some old case files, she explained, and she had come across something interesting. There was a state law established in 1989 that allowed for the creation of geological preserves, land that was protected by the state specifically because of its geological interest. Edith's quarry, as a well-preserved example of early granite quarrying technique and geology, might qualify for such a designation. This would mean that the land would be protected forever from development. It would also mean that various rights and restrictions would apply, including public access rights for educational purposes. Margaret wanted to know if Edith would be interested in exploring this possibility. Edith had said yes immediately. This felt right to her. A way of honoring Frank that went beyond the scholarship or the documentation of the fraud. It was a way of saying that this place mattered, that the stone mattered, that the knowledge contained in the quarry's geology mattered. It took another year of paperwork and applications, but eventually the quarry was officially designated as a Vermont Geological Preserve. The state sent officials to survey the property and establish the boundaries of the preserve. They brought geologists who spent hours examining the quarry walls and taking samples and explaining to Edith in great technical detail exactly what made the quarry geologically interesting. It had to do with the way the granite had crystallized and the mineral content and the way the glaciers had carved the valley in previous ice ages. Frank would have been fascinated. Once the preserve status was established, Edith worked with the state and the university to create an educational program. In the summer, geology students could come to the preserve for fieldwork. There was a small pavilion built where interpretive signs explained the geological history of the site. A local high school began bringing its earth science classes to the quarry twice a year. Edith often sat on the rim on those occasions and watched the young people look at stone with careful attention. She liked to imagine that Frank was there too, somewhere in the granite, teaching them to see. As the years passed, Edith became less of a widow and more of a woman who had been married to someone for nearly 50 years and who was still, in a sense, married to him. Not in the literal sense. She did not hold romantic feelings or experience grief in the acute way that she had in those first years, but she remained connected to Frank in ways that seemed increasingly real and undeniable. When she faced difficult decisions, she asked herself what Frank would have done. When she read something interesting, she imagined explaining it to Frank. When she sat by the quarry at sunset, she felt his presence not as something spooky or supernatural, but as something entirely natural, the continuation of a conversation that had been going on for nearly 50 years and saw no reason to stop, just because one party had died. In the autumn of her 80th year, Edith sat on her favorite stone at the quarry's edge and reflected on the improbability of her life. She was an old woman now, definitively old, beyond the point where it was possible to pretend otherwise. Her hands had spots on them, her hair had thinned, her hearing was not what it once was, but her mind remained clear, and her hands were steady enough to do the careful work of maintaining Frank's notebooks and caring for his stone collection. She had lived long enough to see Ray Cosgrove's dishonesty exposed. She had lived long enough to see Frank's scholarship support dozens of students. She had lived long enough to understand, with absolute certainty, that truth had weight in the world and that integrity was not an abstract concept, but a practical one. The brown leather suitcase with brass clasps that had belonged to Frank's father still sat in the corner of her cabin. She had not needed to use it in years, but she kept it there as a kind of memorial. Sometimes, when she was feeling particularly sentimental, she would open it and smell the leather and think about all the journeys it had represented. Frank's father had used it to travel to quarries all over New England. Frank had never used it much, but he had kept it, the way one keeps objects that have weight and meaning. Now Edith kept it, and someday it would go to Karen, and someday to Karen's children, and someday, perhaps to their descendants. The suitcase would outlast all of them. Edith had been faithful. Frank had been faithful. The quarry had been faithful. And now, in this small cabin built from quarry stone, in this place that had belonged to Frank's family for generations, Edith sat and drank her tea and felt, for the first time since Frank's death and continuously ever since, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She was home. She was safe. The truth had been protected. Justice had been served, and the story of Frank and Edith Garner was written now, not just in perfect books and legal documents, but in stone and water, and the memory of one woman's determined, quiet grief. And in the foundation of the cabin that stood witness to it all,